700 wives and 300 concubines. That's the official count for King Solomon. Now, I don't know about you, but I think that's crazy. How do you manage that many women? How do you even remember their names so you can tell one from the other? Now, to be fair to Solomon, he probably didn't spend much time with those women at all. You see, we're told in the scriptures that most of his wives were daughters of rulers from other nations. And it was the practice back in those days for kings to marry off their daughters to other kings in order to form a political alliance, so there'd be peace between the two nations. This wasn't so much a marriage as a political arrangement. Now, the king himself, with all of his wives, would rarely interact with those individual wives, if he ever did at all. You see, it never really was much of a marriage, even though those ladies would certainly be well taken care of, each one given their palace and their provisions, but the king himself, he often would not appear. Now, if you look at Solomon's story, 700 and 300, that's too many women. And I think Solomon knew it. Solomon said, don't spend your time and your strength on chasing women. Don't put your vigor into those who can ruin kings. Now, this is not the way that marriage ought to be. It certainly falls short of the ideal that God set in the Garden of Eden, when, as our traditional wedding ceremony says, when God joined together our first parents, Adam and Eve, in holy matrimony. You see, we can look at Solomon and we shake our heads at what he did, but I still want you to listen to what he said, his inspired words of wisdom on how marriage truly should be done. First, though, let me give you a word about ancient proverbs. They were typically written from the male perspective. Now, that makes sense when you realize that most of the writers of Proverbs would have been men, but it's also a part of a style. That is, Proverbs were often put together as if it was a wisdom passed on from parent to son. Listen closely to your father. Heed the words of your mother, my son. It was written to the young boys. Now, if you're reading the Solomon Proverbs, it can be a little bit annoying for you ladies, this constant emphasis on the men, and sometimes the way that the women might be portrayed in a marriage. You'd almost get the impression that the wives get the short end of the stick. For example, there'll be an emphasis on the female seductress. Oh, he'll warn the husband, be careful, watch out for the smooth talk of the wayward woman. From her lips, she'll be dripping honey. Her speech is smoother than oil, but then in the end, she's as bitter as gall, sharp as a double-edged sword. Now, you and I know the reality that men can just as well be a smooth-talking devil as a woman can be. In fact, it goes both ways. That's why I want to recommend this to you. When you read ancient proverbs, especially the ones in the Bible, you need to translate to the generic. That is, to something that everybody can benefit from, and not just the men. Now, if a proverb is very narrowly focused on men versus women, or women versus men, that's fine. But for most proverbs, they can be read as universals, and that way we all learn the lesson. So, with that in mind, let me take the Proverbs of Solomon and give you a word to the wise. Here's my first word, respect. Respect for the marriage covenant. Solomon speaks of an adulterous woman who ignored the covenant that she made before God. That's a good way to describe how marriage operates. You've heard it in the wedding ceremony, that this is being made before these witnesses and in the presence of God. What we say in a marriage when we make our vows, when we make our commitment, it is a solemn vow before God, and thus ought to be taken seriously. And those who break their promise, the promise they made in their wedding, they've made a promise and broken it before God. Another word to the wise would be fidelity. In other words, no infidelity. You know what that means. No adultery, no cheating on your spouse. Solomon does teach that. He says, drink water from your own cistern and fresh water from your own well. Now, ladies, whether you like the imagery or not, you get the idea that here in my house, I've got the place I draw the refreshing water that I enjoy. You get the imagery there. And you don't need to be going to your neighbor's house and drawing from his well, that is, from his wife. Well, this is one of the cardinal rules of Scripture. It's commandment number 7 in the Big Ten Commandments. Not only is it a commandment thing, it's also something that wisdom teaches. Adultery is a foolish thing contrary to wisdom. As Solomon explains, if you commit adultery, you're just asking for trouble. Now, on a personal level, one type of trouble is the guilty conscience, as you then try to hide what you did from your spouse. Also, there's all sorts of troubles when your spouse finally figures it out, and eventually it often gets revealed, and now the real troubles begin. First, adultery can arouse feelings of anger and betrayal in the person upon whom you cheated, and it's a very dangerous thing to get that person upset. Solomon has this particular imagery. He says, can a man scoop up fire, say from a campfire, and put it in his lap, and everything going to be okay? The answer is no. Can a man walk on hot coals and it not burn his feet? Of course, the answer is no. So it is the one who sleeps with another man's wife. The one who touches her will not go unpunished. And he describes what happens when the other husband finds out. Jealousy arouses a husband's fury, and he will show no mercy when he comes to take revenge. Now, Solomon warns you, you don't want to get on the bad side of a husband who you've been sleeping with his wife. Solomon says that adultery can ruin your life. He describes it this way with imagery. He says it's like an ox going to the slaughter, like a deer stepping into a noose, like a bird that darts into a snare, little knowing that this is going to cost you your life. He describes it as a highway to the grave, leading down to the chambers of death. And if you're not careful, you could lose everything you truly value. Your marriage, your children, your friends, your job, your reputation. You see, that's what happens sometimes when one spouse catches the other cheating. Trust is broken, and before you know it, the marriage splits up. And while one party was just having a moment of pleasure, I didn't mean anything, I really love you, you may lose that relationship because they don't trust you. Children can be alienated from the parent who has hurt the other parent. Friends have to choose sides, sometimes not choosing yours. And if you have a job that has a moral clause, you could lose your job and your reputation damaged because you wanted to have some fun. You know, as the old phrase says, you don't know what you've got until it's gone, and then it's too late to do anything about it. Let me give you another word to the wise, integrity. And by that, I'm particularly focused on beware of sexual lust. Solomon says, do not lust in your heart after her beauty. Don't let her captivate you with her eyes. Now, it's the same warning that Jesus gave in the Sermon on the Mount when he talked about the lust of the eye and where you may need to pluck your eye out if it gets you in trouble. Now, let me tell you that sexual lust can happen easily to anyone, especially those who've indulged in watching it too closely, spending too much time looking. It's easy for sexual lust to arise in the heart. Now, preventing sexual lust is a good thing if you can, but controlling your actions, that's essential. That is, regardless of what you think, there is no excuse for acting on those thoughts and those feelings, for doing what you dreamed of doing. You see, this is where the integrity thing comes in. You need to have a line in the sand, lines that you do not cross. And it doesn't matter how you feel. It doesn't matter how tempting the situation is or how convenient and easy it would be or how irresistible the person is. It doesn't matter. There are lines we simply do not cross. You don't act on the lust that you're feeling. And I advise you, don't be standing too near the edges either. Back off, because it's a matter of integrity. Solomon goes on to say, may your fountain be blessed, and may you rejoice in the wife of your youth. Tell you what he's talking about there. We get off when we're young and we're so excited and we're falling madly in love with one another, but as we age over the decades, well, the guy says, you know, she's not as young and attractive as she used to be. This young girl over here is a little more attractive. Now, this is that aging problem, but what I would remind you is that, hey, you're aging just as much as she is. Both of you need to not look on the surface at the superficial, but you need to look back inside at the real beauty I hope you saw from the very beginning. And so it is, you stay committed to the one you were committed to in the first place, back when you both were young. Here's a word to the wise, appreciation. Appreciate the good thing you've got. If you've got a good marriage, a good husband, good wife, that's a blessing from the Lord. As Solomon says, houses and wealth are inherited from parents, but a smart wife, she's from the Lord. And when he says a wife of noble character who can find, he doesn't mean it's hard to find. No, what he means is it's a great find, worth the search, worth the effort to find just the right person. Because when you do, she's worth far more than rubies. And her husband has full confidence in her. He lacks nothing of value. She brings him good, never harm, all the days of her life. You see, for all of Solomon's faults, he does paint the picture of what a good marriage looks like. And you and I can learn from that. So here's what I'll say to you. If you have a good marriage, then I would advise you to appreciate the good thing you have and do your best to preserve it.